We're telling ourselves a comforting lie about American power. We look at a country like Venezuela, at the empty shelves, the hyperinflation, the desperate refugees, and we tell ourselves that this is what happens when you cross the United States. We tell ourselves that our sanctions worked, that our leverage is absolute, and that the dollar is still the only game in town. But if you look past the poverty and look at the plumbing, you will see something that should terrify any serious American strategist. You will see a regime that has been cut off from the Western financial system for years, and yet is still standing. Why? Because Venezuela is no longer just a failed state. It is a laboratory. It is a live fire test environment where Beijing is proving that a country can survive without the US dollar. They are building a parallel architecture, boring, slow, and invisible to most of us, that turns American sanctions from a death sentence into a manageable inconvenience. And the most dangerous part isn't that our rivals are building this exit ramp. It is that our own volatility, our own lack of discipline, is driving the rest of the world to use it. We are watching the erosion of the American monopoly in real time, not because we are weak, but because we are careless. I am Ren Aoyama. I don't deal in comfortable myths, and I don't sell panic. I deal in leverage, logistics, and the hard reality of national interest. If you are ready to understand how the ground is actually shifting beneath our feet and why Washington refuses to admit it, make the choice to subscribe right now. Let's walk through the architecture of the decline. If you look at the standard map of American foreign policy, or listen to the way Washington talks about the global economy, you are presented with a picture of absolute, unshakable stability. It is a comforting picture. It tells you that the United States is the sun around which the rest of the world orbits. It tells you that the dollar is not just a currency, but a law of physics, something that cannot be opted out of. And it tells you that when a country like Venezuela collapses, it is an isolated event, a local failure, a tragic mix of incompetence and corruption that has nothing to do with us, other than perhaps the price of gas at the pump. We are told that Venezuela is a, quote, failed state. That is the phrase you hear on cable news. They show you the empty shelves in Caracas. They show you the hyperinflation. They interview the desperate refugees fleeing across the border. And the takeaway, the subtext of every single one of those stories, is that the American system won. We applied sanctions. We turned the screws. Their economy broke. Therefore, we are still in control. That narrative is dangerously incomplete. In fact, it is worse than incomplete. It is a sedative. It lulls you into believing that the old rules of power still apply, that financial pressure from the United States is still a death sentence for any regime that crosses us. But if you look closer, if you stop looking at the poverty and start looking at the plumbing of how that state is still standing, you realize that Venezuela is not just a failure. It is a laboratory. It is a test environment. And what is being tested there is a question that should keep every American strategist awake at night. Can a country survive being cut off from the US dollar? 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the answer was an unqualified no. If the United States Treasury locked you out of SWIFT, if we sanctioned your central bank, your economy didn't just contract, it stopped. You couldn't buy medicine. You couldn't sell oil. You couldn't insure a cargo ship. The dollar was the oxygen, and we controlled the valve. That was the world we built. That was the source of our leverage. It wasn't just about aircraft carriers. It was about the fact that no one could do business without touching our banking system. But look at Caracas today. The government is still there. The oil is still moving. It is moving slower, yes. It is moving inefficiently, but it is moving. The lights are flickering, but they haven't gone out. How is that possible? It is possible because the nature of the global system has changed while we were busy congratulating ourselves on our dominance. We treat China's involvement in South America as purely transactional. We say, oh, Beijing is just buying cheap oil. We treat it as opportunistic commerce. That is a fundamental misunderstanding of what is happening. China isn't just buying oil. China is building an architecture. For the last decade, beneath the noise of trade wars and tariffs, beneath the rhetoric of great power competition, Beijing has been quietly laying down a financial infrastructure designed for exactly this moment. They didn't come in with aircraft carriers. They came in with credit lines. They came in with commodity-backed loans. They created a system where Venezuela could pay for infrastructure, for goods, for technology, not with cash, but with oil. This sounds technical, but the implication is radical. When you trade oil for infrastructure directly, when the ledger is settled in goods rather than wire transfers, the US dollar is not required. The transaction becomes invisible to us. We cannot sanction what we cannot see. We cannot block a transaction that never touches a New York correspondent bank. This is the erosion of American power. It doesn't look like a war. It looks like a spreadsheet. It looks like a quiet agreement between a state-owned enterprise in Beijing and a state-owned oil company in Caracas. It is boring. It is slow. And it is dismantling the primary lever of American influence in the 21st century. We have to stop telling ourselves the story that dollar dominance is magic. The dollar is dominant because it is convenient and because it is trusted. It is a habit. Global commerce uses dollars because it is the path of least resistance. But what happens when Washington decides to weaponize that habit? What happens when we use the dollar not just as a currency, but as a bludgeon to enforce political outcomes? We assume the world has no choice but to take it. We assume that because there is no replacement for the dollar today, there never will be. But history is littered with empires that confused indispensable with immovable. China understands this. They are not trying to replace the dollar tomorrow. That is a straw man argument that American economists love to defeat. They say the yuan isn't ready to be the global reserve currency. And they are right. But China doesn't need to replace the dollar everywhere. They only need to create a safety valve. They only need to build a mechanism that allows countries to survive American pressure. And that is what Venezuela represents. It is the proof of concept. The Chinese have proven that with enough credit, with enough direct barter, and with enough state-backed patience, they can keep a regime on life support indefinitely, even against the maximum pressure of the United States. Think about what that means for our foreign policy. If the threat of sanctions no longer guarantees collapse, then our leverage has evaporated. If a dictator knows that he has a fallback option, that there is a window in Beijing he can go to when the door in Washington slams shut, then the cost of defiance goes down. We are looking at a broken model. We are operating on the assumption that we hold all the cards, that we control the financial atmosphere. But the air is leaking out of the room. The stability we think we see is false. It is a facade held up by inertia. The reality is that the monopoly is already broken. The alternative system isn't theoretical, it is operational. It is functioning right now in the Caribbean. And every day that we pretend this is just a failed state story, every day we ignore the deliberate, structural decoupling being engineered by our competitors, is a day we lose ground that we will never get back. We are not watching a crisis in Venezuela. We are watching the beta test of a post-American world. And the terrifying part is not that it's happening. The terrifying part is that we still think we're the ones in control. This brings us to the architecture of the challenge. And I use the word architecture deliberately. There is a lazy assumption in Washington that China is reactive. We tend to view their moves in South America or Africa as scrambling responses to American strength, that they are just picking up the scraps we leave behind. We look at a deal in Caracas or a port in Pakistan and we think, oh, they're just being opportunistic. That is a dangerous underestimation of the timeline Beijing is operating on. China is not reacting to us. For the last 20 years, they have been anticipating us. They looked at the global board, they looked at the crushing weight of the US dollar system, and they realized they could not fight it head on. They knew that if they tried to set up a direct competitor to the dollar, a red Swift, it would fail. The network effects of the American system are just too strong. So they didn't try to replace the building. They started wiring the basement. What we are seeing in Venezuela is not a random collection of loans. It is the operational debut of a parallel operating system. It works because it is designed to be incredibly boring, incredibly slow, and completely legal. It is designed specifically to fly under the radar of American crisis management. Here's how it works. It's not about suitcases of cash. It's about credit for resource swaps. The mechanism is almost deceptively simple. China approaches a country like Venezuela, a country that is resource-rich but cash-poor and politically isolated, and they offer a lifeline. But it isn't aid. It is strictly business. Beijing says, we will extend you a $50 billion credit line. You can use this credit to buy Chinese goods, Chinese telecom equipment, Chinese engineering for your dams and bridges. You don't get the cash, you get the capacity. And in return, you don't pay us back in currency. You pay us back in oil. Shipments of crude. Hundreds of thousands of barrels a day, locking in repayment for years, sometimes decades. Now, pause and look at the genius of that structure from a strategic perspective. First, it completely removes the US dollar from the equation. There is no wire transfer for the US Treasury to block. There is no bank account in New York to freeze. It is a barter economy at the scale of a nation-state. One side sends turbines, the other side sends tankers. The transaction is hermetically sealed against American financial pressure. Second, it converts financial debt into physical obligation. If Venezuela defaults on a bond held by Wall Street, they get sued in a New York court. It's a legal mess, but life goes on. But if they stiff Beijing on an oil shipment, the infrastructure stops. The spare parts stop. The technical support for the power grid stops. The leverage China holds is tangible. It is physical. It is immediate. This is what I mean by architecture. They have built a lattice of dependency that functions entirely outside the Western liberal order. And the most disturbing part? They are willing to lose money to do it. This is where American analysts get it wrong. We look at Venezuela's crumbling economy and we say, China made a bad bet. They're losing billions. They'll pull out soon. We project our own quarterly earnings mindset onto a strategic rival that plans in generations. Beijing doesn't care about the return on investment in the way a hedge fund does. They are not looking for a quarterly profit. They are paying a premium for strategic access. They are willing to eat the financial loss in Venezuela because it buys them two things that are priceless. One, it guarantees a flow of energy resources that the US Navy cannot easily interdict in a crisis. Two, it proves to the rest of the world that there is a survival option outside the American orbit. Think about the signal that sends. If you are an autocrat in Africa or a shaky regime in Central Asia, and you are watching Venezuela, you are learning a lesson. You are seeing that you can mismanage your economy, you can abuse your population, you can alienate the United States and Europe, and you will not necessarily fall. There is a floor. China creates a floor. It is a low floor. It is an ugly floor. Life in Venezuela is not good. But the regime survives. The hierarchy stays intact. And for the people running these countries, survival is the only metric that matters. This is the quiet architecture. It is not designed to defeat the United States in a war. It is not designed to make the yuan the world's reserve currency by next Tuesday. It is designed to erode the efficacy of American power. The goal isn't to replace the dollar. The goal is to reduce the cost of ignoring it. If the United States imposes sanctions and the target country collapses, our power is absolute. But if the United States imposes sanctions and the target country just pivots to a pre-built Chinese barter network and limps along, then our power is performative. We are shouting commands at a room that has stopped listening. We are seeing the normalization of a post-dollar survival kit. And the more we use our financial weapons, the more we sanction, the more we exclude, the more we incentivize China to expand this architecture. And the more we incentivize other nations to sign up for it. We are not dealing with a competitor who wants to win a debate. We are dealing with a competitor who is slowly, methodically, pouring concrete into the exits, ensuring that when the next crisis hits, the world discovers that the American system is no longer the only way out. That is the leverage they are building. It is not about flash, it is about friction. They are increasing the friction of American leadership until it becomes too costly to maintain. And looking at Caracas, looking at the survival of a state that by all rights should have failed years ago, you have to admit, it is working. This brings us to the most uncomfortable part of the diagnosis. It is the part that no one in Washington likes to talk about honestly, because it requires us to look in the mirror. We have talked about China's quiet architecture. We have talked about the erosion of the dollar. But neither of those things would be fatal on their own. The Chinese strategy relies on one critical variable to succeed. They need the United States to cooperate in its own marginalization. And for the last several years, under the banner of America First, under the guise of Trumpism and populist nationalism, we have been giving them exactly what they need. Let's be clear about something before we go further. The United States is not weak. We are not a paper tiger. We possess the deepest capital markets, the most lethal military, and the most robust institutional capacity in human history. If this were a contest of raw capability, it wouldn't even be close. But power is not just about capability. It is about how that capability is wielded. And this is where the strategic logic of Trumpism, and I'm not talking about the tweets, I'm talking about the governing philosophy, has become a massive strategic liability. The core tenet of that philosophy is that every interaction is a transaction. Every alliance is a protection racket. Every trade deal is a zero-sum game, where if you win, I lose. It treats the global order not as a garden that needs tending, but as a real estate deal that needs to be squeezed. This approach feels good. It feels strong. When a president threatens tariffs on a Tuesday, or threatens to abandon NATO on a Wednesday, or unilaterally sanctions a partner on a Thursday, it looks like dominance. It triggers a dopamine hit for a certain segment of the electorate that says, finally, we are punching back. But in the world of high strategy, it is suicide. Here is why. The American system, the system that won the Cold War, was built on reliability. It was built on the idea that while the US was the hegemon, it was a predictable hegemon. We wrote the rules, but we also followed them. Allies knew that if they invested in the dollar, if they integrated with our economy, we wouldn't rug pull them on a whim. That predictability is what made the dollar as good as gold. Trumpism takes a sledgehammer to that predictability. It replaces institutional continuity with executive caprice. When you use the global financial system as a tool of personal or partisan retribution, when you weaponize the dollar against allies and adversaries alike with no clear strategic framework, you change the calculus for everyone else. Put yourself in the shoes of a finance minister in Brazil or India or even Germany. You look at Washington and you see volatility. You see a leadership class that is willing to break contracts and ignore norms for short-term domestic applause. You have to ask yourself, can I afford to be 100% dependent on the American system? 5 years ago, the answer was, I have no choice. Today, thanks to that Chinese architecture we just discussed, the answer is, maybe I should hedge. And that is the poison pill. Hedging. The moment our allies start hedging, the moment they start signing those bilateral currency swap agreements with Beijing, not because they love China, but because they are terrified of American unpredictability, the game changes. We are literally driving business into the arms of our competitors. China knows this. They love Trumpism. They might hate the tariffs, they might hate the rhetoric, but strategically, they understand that nothing accelerates the decline of American influence faster than an American president who tells the world that the United States is no longer interested in leading, only in winning. We are seeing a transition from American leadership to American coercion. Leadership attracts, coercion repels. You can coerce a country into following your sanctions for a year. You can bully a company into canceling a deal. But you are burning down the capital of trust that took 70 years to build. And the irony is bitter. The America First movement claims to be about restoring respect, but in reality, it is hollowing out the very institutions that command that respect. You cannot maintain global financial dominance if the world views your financial system as a political weapon that might go off in their face at any moment. This is the strategic friction we are creating. We are making the dollar risky. We are making alignment with the US risky. China doesn't have to be better than us. They don't have to be freer than us. They don't even have to be richer than us. They just have to be the steady hand while we are flailing. They just have to offer the no-drama option. When we tear up trade deals, they sign them. When we threaten to pull out of regions, they invest in them. They are drafting off our volatility. So when we look at the rise of this alternative order, we cannot just blame Beijing's ambition. We have to acknowledge our own self-sabotage. We have taken the greatest strategic asset in the history of the world, the trust and reliance of the global economy, and we have treated it like a disposable bargaining chip. The damage is not abstract, it is structural. Every time we act unilaterally, every time we choose spectacle over strategy, we are teaching the world how to live without us. And once they learn that lesson, they do not unlearn it. We are doing the work of our enemies for them. We are validating their propaganda. They tell the world the US is unstable, arrogant, and unreliable. And instead of proving them wrong, our political class lines up to prove them right. This is not a partisan point. The markets do not care about red or blue. They care about risk. And right now, the United States is pricing itself into the market as a risk factor. That is a trajectory that ends in only one place. A world where American power is no longer systemic, but merely sporadic. A world where we can shout, but we can no longer steer. The decline we fear is not being imposed on us. It is being manufactured in Washington. And the bill is coming due. So, where does this leave us? If you listen to the doomsayers, the internet grifters selling gold coins, or the hyper-nationalists in Beijing, the conclusion is simple. The American empire is over. The dollar is dead. And the future is Chinese. I want to be very clear. That is nonsense. The United States is not going to collapse. The dollar is not going to zero. We are not going to wake up tomorrow and find that the yuan has replaced the greenback in the wallets of shopkeepers in Lagos or Lima. The global economy is a massive tanker. It takes decades to turn, and the momentum of American influence is still the strongest force on the planet. But rejecting the apocalypse doesn't mean we can embrace complacency. The danger isn't that the American system explodes. The danger is that it slowly, irrevocably shrinks. We need to understand the concept of inertia. In geopolitics, as in physics, objects in motion stay in motion. But in economics, systems that fragment rarely reconverge. Think about the mechanisms we've discussed. The parallel banking rails, the oil for infrastructure swaps, the bilateral currency deals. These things were created as emergency exits. They were created because countries felt they needed a workaround to survive American pressure or American instability. But here is the hard truth. Once you build an emergency exit, you don't brick it up just because the fire alarm stops ringing. You keep it, you maintain it, you expand it. This is the point of no easy return. Even if Washington woke up tomorrow with perfect leadership, even if we returned to a foreign policy of absolute consistency, rationality, and respect for alliances, we cannot undo the infrastructure that has already been built. We cannot ask the world to unlearn the lesson that the dollar can be weaponized. We cannot ask China to dismantle the payment networks they have spent billions constructing. That genie is out of the bottle. The alternative pipes are laid. The contracts are signed. The habit of looking for a second option has begun to harden into a norm. And once a global norm shifts, it does not shift back. We are entering a world of permanent fragmentation. We are moving from a unipolar financial order, where the dollar was the only game in town, to a multi-nodal order, where the dollar is the biggest game, but not the only one. And this has profound implications for how the United States must operate. For the last 30 years, American influence was essentially on autopilot. We didn't have to work hard to get people to use our currency or follow our sanctions. They did it because there was no other choice. We could be sloppy, we could be arrogant, we could be internally divided, and the world still had to come to us. Those days are over. The strategic corridor has narrowed. We no longer have the luxury of mistakes. If we want to maintain our position as the anchor of the global system, we have to recognize that leadership is no longer an inheritance. It is a competitive sport. We have to earn the continued use of the dollar. We have to compete for the loyalty of our allies. We have to demonstrate every single day that the American system offers better stability, better rule of law, and better returns than the Chinese alternative. We cannot demand allegiance anymore. We have to court it. And this is where the damage of the last few years becomes so expensive. Trust is not a renewable resource. You cannot burn it down for 4 years, hit a reset button, and expect the forest to grow back overnight. The world is watching us. They are watching our polarization. They are watching our debt. They are watching our inability to pass a budget without a crisis. And every time we stumble, the calculation shifts a little more toward diversification. Every time we falter, the Chinese Plan B looks a little less like a gamble and a little more like a prudent insurance policy. We are not facing a cliff. We are facing a slope, a long, grinding slope, where every step back up requires twice the effort it took to slide down. This is the reality we have to accept. There is no quick fix. There is no election cycle that solves this. The structural monopoly is gone. The era of easy dominance is gone. The question is not whether we can stop the rise of a parallel system. That system is already here. The question is whether the United States has the discipline, the maturity, and the strategic patience to ensure that our system remains the one the world wants to choose, rather than the one they are forced to escape. That is the challenge. It is not insurmountable, but it requires us to stop pretending that the old world still exists and start doing the hard work of securing our place in the new one.